There is a belief deeply rooted in society that family is forever. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, that no matter what happens, family should always remain connected. So when someone chooses to walk away from their own family, many people immediately judge them. They call them selfish, cold, ungrateful, or heartless. But what if the truth is far more complicated? What if cutting off family isn't always an act of hatred, but an act of survival? The human mind is shaped by the relationships it experiences first. Long before we understand the world, we learn about love, trust, safety, and our own worth through the people who raise us. When those relationships become sources of constant pain instead of protection, the deepest psychological conflict begins. Today, we're going to explore the hidden psychology behind people who cut off their families. Not to encourage separation, nor to condemn reconciliation, but to understand what happens inside a person when walking away becomes the only path they can see. We'll explore 3 powerful psychological truths that explain why some people make this painful decision, and what it reveals about the human soul. There is a quiet tragedy that unfolds behind closed doors, one that rarely receives sympathy because it is almost invisible to those who have never lived it. Society often assumes that the strongest family is the one that stays together, no matter the cost. From childhood, we hear phrases that teach us loyalty above all else. We are told that family must always be forgiven, always be honored, and always be kept close. Yet, these beliefs become painfully complicated when the very people who were meant to provide safety become the source of fear, shame, or emotional exhaustion. To an outsider, leaving a family may appear cruel, but to the person who walks away, it often feels like taking their first full breath after years of slowly suffocating. The human heart is not built to reject the people it first learned to love. Every child enters the world with an instinctive desire to belong. Long before we learn language, we search for comfort in familiar faces, gentle voices, and reassuring touch. These early experiences quietly shape our understanding of ourselves. When love is offered freely, a child grows believing they are worthy of kindness. But when affection is conditional, when approval must constantly be earned, or when criticism becomes more common than encouragement, a dangerous belief begins to grow beneath the surface. The child slowly starts to believe that love is something that must be chased rather than received. This belief often follows them into adulthood. They become experts at pleasing others while abandoning themselves. They apologize even when they have done nothing wrong. They tolerate disrespect because it feels strangely familiar. They continue returning to relationships that leave them wounded because pain they recognize feels safer than peace they have never experienced. Familiar suffering can become a prison that disguises itself as loyalty. The mind convinces itself that enduring more pain is proof of love, while the soul quietly begs for relief. Many people spend years trying to repair relationships that have never truly repaired them. They believe that one more conversation will finally change everything. They hope that one more achievement will earn the approval they have spent their entire lives seeking. They imagine that if they become more patient, more successful, more understanding, or less emotional, they will finally receive the acceptance they have always desired. Yet each disappointment deepens the wound, because the problem was never their lack of worth. The problem was expecting healing from those who refused to acknowledge the harm they caused. Psychological research on adverse childhood experiences has shown that chronic emotional neglect, constant criticism, and ongoing family conflict can leave lasting effects on both the mind and body. Anxiety, depression, chronic stress, and difficulties forming healthy relationships often emerge not because someone is weak, but because they adapted to survive an environment where emotional safety was uncertain. Survival teaches remarkable lessons, but it also teaches habits that become difficult to unlearn. Hypervigilance, people-pleasing, emotional numbness, and fear of rejection were once protective responses. Over time, they become invisible chains. Imagine a woman who has spent 30 years trying to earn her father's approval. Every accomplishment is met with another criticism. Every success is followed by a reminder that she could have done better. She becomes successful in her career, admired by colleagues, respected by friends, yet every visit home leaves her feeling like the frightened child she thought she had left behind. One day she realizes that no achievement will ever silence the voice that tells her she is not enough, because that voice was never truly her own. It was placed there long ago, repeated so often that it became part of her inner dialogue. Walking away from that environment is not an act of revenge. It is the beginning of separating her true identity from the beliefs that were forced upon her. Choosing peace often feels terrifying because it is unfamiliar. The human mind naturally returns to what it knows, even when what it knows is painful. Predictable suffering can feel safer than uncertain freedom. This is why some people remain in destructive relationships for years. The unknown appears more frightening than the pain they have learned to endure, but every meaningful transformation begins with stepping into uncertainty. Growth has never asked for comfort before it asks for courage. Distance does not always mean hatred. Silence does not always mean bitterness. Sometimes the greatest expression of self-respect is refusing to continue participating in a pattern that slowly destroys your spirit. There are moments when love for others must no longer come at the expense of love for yourself. In those moments, choosing peace is not abandoning your family. It is refusing to abandon your own humanity. The path may be lonely, misunderstood, and filled with guilt, but every step taken toward inner peace is also a step toward becoming the person you were always meant to be, rather than the person your pain demanded you become. No one enters the world carrying their own emotional wounds. They inherit patterns long before they inherit beliefs. A child does not choose the atmosphere in which they are raised. They simply adapt to it. If love is expressed through warmth and understanding, they learn that relationships are places of safety. If love is mixed with fear, manipulation, silence, or constant criticism, they begin to accept those experiences as normal. This is how emotional patterns quietly travel from one generation to the next, not because people deliberately choose to pass on pain, but because they often give away only what they themselves have received. Many families unknowingly repeat the same cycles for decades. One generation teaches the next that emotions should be hidden because vulnerability is weakness. Another teaches that obedience is more important than honesty. Some children grow up believing that affection must always be earned, while others are taught that speaking their truth is an act of betrayal. These lessons are rarely spoken aloud. They are absorbed through daily experiences, repeated conversations, and silent expectations until they become part of a person's identity. The most dangerous patterns are often the ones that feel ordinary. A child who grows up surrounded by shouting may believe that conflict is simply what love looks like. Someone raised by emotionally unavailable parents may struggle to recognize genuine affection because distance feels familiar. A person constantly blamed for problems beyond their control may spend the rest of their life apologizing for things that were never their fault. These behaviors become deeply rooted, shaping relationships, careers, and even the way a person speaks to themselves in moments of failure. Research into intergenerational trauma suggests that unresolved emotional pain can influence parenting styles, family dynamics, and stress responses across generations. While each family is unique, the effects of prolonged fear, neglect, or instability often echo through time. The wounds may change their appearance, but they continue to exist until someone has the courage to face them. Every generation stands at a crossroads. One path continues the familiar pattern. The other demands the uncomfortable work of change. Breaking that cycle is one of the hardest psychological battles a person can face because it requires questioning everything that once felt normal. It asks someone to examine beliefs they never consciously chose. It forces them to ask painful questions. Why do I feel guilty whenever I set boundaries? Why do I mistake control for care? Why do I believe that my value depends on pleasing everyone else? These questions do not simply challenge behavior. They challenge identity. They require a person to separate who they truly are from who they were conditioned to become. Imagine a young man raised in a home where anger solved every disagreement. As a child, he watched doors slam, voices rise, and silence replace understanding. For years, he assumed that every relationship would eventually become a battlefield. Then one day, he became a father. He looked into the eyes of his own child and realized that he stood at a defining moment. He could continue reacting the only way he had ever known, or he could stop, breathe, and choose something different. That decision was not made once. It had to be made every single day. Every moment he chose patience over rage, listening over shouting, and compassion over control. He weakened a chain that had existed long before he was born. Real transformation rarely receives immediate acceptance. Families built upon unhealthy patterns often resist anyone who challenges them. When one person refuses to participate in manipulation, others may accuse them of becoming distant. When someone begins setting healthy boundaries, they may be called selfish. When they stop carrying responsibilities that never belong to them, they may be labeled ungrateful. This happens because unhealthy systems depend upon predictability. The moment one person changes, the entire balance begins to shift, and that change can feel threatening to those who are comfortable with the familiar. History reminds us that meaningful change has always begun with individuals willing to endure misunderstanding. Every significant transformation, whether within society or within a single family, starts with someone deciding that the past does not have to dictate the future. They accept the loneliness that often accompanies growth because they understand that temporary discomfort is a small price to pay for lasting freedom. Breaking generational patterns is not about proving that previous generations were entirely wrong. Many parents and grandparents carried burdens they never had the opportunity to heal. They often acted from their own unresolved fears, believing they were doing the best they could with the emotional tools they possessed. Understanding this truth creates compassion, but compassion should never become permission to continue harmful behavior. You can recognize another person's pain without allowing it to define your own life. The person who breaks the cycle often feels isolated because they are stepping into unfamiliar territory. They become the first to speak openly about emotions, the first to apologize sincerely, the first to refuse manipulation, and the first to believe that love should never require the loss of one's dignity. Their journey is difficult because they are building a new path where none previously existed. Yet every act of courage becomes an invisible gift to those who follow. The healing they choose today becomes the inheritance of tomorrow, proving that while pain may be passed from one generation to the next, so can wisdom, compassion, and the quiet strength to create a different future. One of the greatest misunderstandings about healing is the belief that forgiveness and reconciliation are the same thing. People often encourage those who have been deeply hurt to move on, let it go, or keep the family together, as though the passage of time alone can repair wounds that continue to be reopened. But emotional healing does not begin by pretending the pain never existed. It begins with the courage to acknowledge it honestly. The mind cannot heal from what the heart is forced to deny. Many people remain trapped in unhealthy family relationships because they fear the guilt that comes with creating distance. They worry that stepping away means they are abandoning the people who raised them. They question whether protecting themselves makes them selfish. These thoughts can become overwhelming because the desire to belong is one of the strongest forces within human nature. From childhood, we learn that acceptance brings safety. We are taught to preserve harmony, even when that harmony comes at the expense of our own well-being. Over time, this creates an inner conflict where the need for peace battles against the fear of rejection. Imagine someone trying to recover from a serious physical injury while being asked to run every day. No matter how determined they are, the wound cannot close because it is constantly being strained. Emotional wounds follow the same principle. When a person remains in an environment where they are repeatedly criticized, manipulated, humiliated, or made to feel insignificant, the healing process is interrupted again and again. The problem is not a lack of forgiveness. The problem is the continued presence of the very conditions that caused the injury in the first place. Healthy boundaries are often misunderstood because they make other people uncomfortable. A boundary is not an act of punishment. It is not revenge, nor is it an attempt to control someone else's behavior. A boundary is simply the recognition that every human being has limits, and those limits deserve respect. Clinical psychologists have long recognized that clear boundaries are essential for emotional well-being because they help protect a person's sense of identity, reduce chronic stress, and encourage healthier relationships. Without boundaries, people slowly lose the ability to distinguish where another person's expectations end and their own needs begin. Consider the story of a man who spent most of his adult life trying to rebuild a relationship with his father. Every conversation began with hope and ended in disappointment. His father apologized many times, promising that things would be different, yet each reunion returned to the same familiar cycle of blame, anger, and emotional neglect. For years, the son believed that trying harder would eventually create the relationship he had always longed for. He carried the burden of responsibility, convinced that if he could only find the right words or become a better son, everything would change. But one day he recognized a painful truth. He was trying to build trust alone, while trust can only exist when both people are willing to change. Choosing distance was not an act of hatred. It was an acknowledgement that hope without change eventually becomes another form of suffering. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to experience silence without guilt. At first, the silence felt frightening because it was unfamiliar. Then something unexpected happened. The constant anxiety began to fade. He no longer woke each morning wondering what criticism or disappointment awaited him. His thoughts became clearer. He laughed more easily. He started discovering parts of himself that had been buried beneath years of emotional survival. The peace he found did not erase his grief, but it gave him the strength to carry it without losing himself. This is one of the deepest truths about healing. Sometimes the greatest obstacle to recovery is not the memory of the wound, but the ongoing exposure to the person who keeps creating it. Love cannot flourish where fear is constant. Respect cannot grow where accountability is absent. Relationships cannot become healthy simply because one person continues sacrificing themselves in the hope that another person will finally change. Real reconciliation requires more than words. It requires humility, accountability, and consistent action. An apology without changed behavior is only another promise waiting to be broken. Trust is not restored through emotion alone. It is rebuilt through repeated evidence that the harmful pattern has truly ended. Until that happens, distance may be the healthiest expression of love a person can choose, not only for themselves, but also for the possibility of a future relationship built on honesty instead of denial. Many people secretly believe that choosing peace means they have stopped loving their family. The opposite is often true. They still carry memories, hopes, and moments of affection. They still wish things had been different. They grieve not only the relationship they lost, but also the relationship they never had. That grief can remain for years because they are mourning an idea as much as a reality. Yet within that sorrow lies an important transformation. They begin to understand that protecting their inner peace is not an act of selfishness, but an act of responsibility. When a person finally learns to value their own emotional well-being, they stop measuring love by how much pain they can endure. Instead, they measure it by whether it allows both people to grow with honesty, respect, and dignity. In that moment, healing is no longer about escaping the past. It becomes the quiet decision to no longer allow the past to decide who they will become. The decision to cut off family is rarely simple. It is often made after years of inner conflict, countless attempts to repair what seemed beyond repair, and the painful realization that love cannot survive where respect is absent. This isn't a story about abandoning family. It's a story about reclaiming one's identity. It reminds us that loyalty without boundaries becomes self-destruction, that inherited pain does not have to define the future, and that true healing sometimes begins with the hardest decision a person will ever make. Before judging someone who has walked away, remember that you are seeing only the final step, not the long road that led there. And if you are someone carrying invisible wounds from your own family, remember this: you are not obligated to remain where your spirit is constantly diminished. Real strength is not measured by how much suffering you can endure. It is measured by the courage to choose truth over illusion, growth over fear, and peace over endless conflict. Because the greatest family you will ever build begins with the relationship you create with yourself.